My boyfriend's strict dad hated my tone after I crashed his car. Now they won't let me forget it. I remember how crisp the air felt as I stepped out of my car in front of my boyfriend's parents' house that New Year's week. Even though it was only the second time I'd visited since he moved a few months earlier, it wasn't entirely unfamiliar. They lived in a sprawling suburban neighborhood 3 hours from my own place, an area lined with neat sidewalks, trimmed bushes, and driveways big enough to fit multiple cars. His family's property was immaculately kept, freshly painted shutters, a sturdy fence running around the backyard, and a neatly stacked pile of firewood by the side of the garage. It was the kind of home that felt lived in but polished, every decoration carefully curated. Despite that outward calm, I was already bracing myself for the usual nerves I felt around his parents, especially his dad, who was old school and a bit strict. I'd driven down because my boyfriend had invited me to ring in the new year with his family. The plan was to spend 4 nights there, go to a party or two, cook a big family meal, and generally celebrate. I remember pulling into their driveway late in the afternoon. My boyfriend Chris was on the porch, one hand shading his eyes to watch my approach. We'd been mid-distance for half a year by then. Just enough distance to complicate quick visits, but not so far that it felt impossible. We wanted to do whatever it took to keep the relationship going. After all, we'd been dating for about 9 months total and had grown closer quick. Chris waved at me and practically jogged to my car, wearing a wide grin that momentarily dispelled all the tension I'd felt on the drive. Though he was 24, something about his expression in that moment, open and eager, reminded me of a much younger version of himself, someone innocent, with that slight inability to hide his feelings. I parked the car, cut the engine, and stepped out. He held me in a quick hug, the kind that conveyed both excitement at my arrival and an undercurrent of relief that I'd made it safely. "You hungry?" he asked, pulling away slightly but keeping his arms around my waist. The crisp air smelled of pine, and I could see lights from neighboring houses twinkling with holiday decorations. "Starving," I admitted. "Traffic was bad, but I'm so glad to be here." He slid his hands off my waist and grabbed my small suitcase from the back seat of my car. I always felt a tinge of guilt whenever he or his family insisted on carrying my things. I grew up in an environment where I did almost everything myself. But here, they saw it as a gesture of courtesy, so I tried to accept it gracefully. We walked up the steps, and the front door opened before we even reached it, revealing his mom. She was wearing a warm sweater and had a bright smile. I liked her. She had an easy way of speaking that comforted me from the very first time I met her. Standing behind her in the hallway was his younger sister, who was fiddling with her phone. The sister gave me a quick wave and a small smile, clearly in mid-text with someone. "Welcome, welcome," his mom said, stepping aside so we could enter. The house was just as cozy inside as it looked from outside. There was a faint smell of home-cooked dinner in the air. Something with onions, maybe, and rosemary. We were just about to finish up. I made a roast. "Hope that's okay." "That sounds wonderful," I replied, placing my coat on the rack near the door. She led us into the living room, and for a moment, I felt that usual mix of warmth and anxiety. This was my boyfriend's family, people I was growing to care about, but also people whose acceptance meant so much to me. As I scanned the room, I noticed photos of Chris's childhood on the mantel. Him in a baseball jersey, him at a piano recital, him and his sister when she was just a toddler. It was a home steeped in memories, the kind I never quite had growing up. My own parents were great in their own ways, but we weren't as close-knit. I tried my best to fit in, but sometimes their family's closeness felt like a reminder of something I'd missed. That first evening went smoothly enough. Chris's dad wasn't home yet. He worked late sometimes, and I spent the evening joking with Chris and helping his mom put the finishing touches on dinner. Over the course of the night, we watched a movie, and I started to relax. We talked about the plans for the coming days, the small gatherings, the fireworks, the local events in town. Chris mentioned at one point that he'd need to go to Academy, a training facility for something he was involved in, on the 3rd day of my visit, and I told him I'd meet up with a friend in town that same day. It sounded like everything would fall neatly into place. The 2nd day was New Year's Eve. We spent it decorating the living room with additional lights, blowing up a few balloons, and helping Chris's mom prepare some hors d'oeuvres. Chris's dad was there, but mostly kept to himself, occasionally asking Chris to help him move something or run an errand. I could sense a certain tension between father and son that day, but I chalked it up to holiday stress. His dad was polite enough to me. He asked about my drive, asked if my family was also celebrating, and I answered. But there was a slight stiffness in his tone. I tried not to take it personally. The man was old school and reserved. Chris had warned me that his father often showed affection by quietly doing things for his family rather than speaking it out loud. That evening, as midnight approached, we all counted down. The TV was on, showing the big festivities in the city. We wore silly party hats, and his mom toasted with champagne. I only had a small glass, but it was enough to make me feel that subtle buzz of celebration. I remember Chris hugging me as we all cheered the turn of the new year, the atmosphere momentarily bright and loud in that living room. It was a snapshot I wanted to keep forever. For a few minutes, I forgot about feeling like an outsider, forgot about any fatherly tension. It was just the five of us starting a new year together. The next morning, New Year's Day, was quieter. We lounged around, some of us nursing slight hangovers or just the exhaustion of staying up late. I spent a bit of time helping Chris's mom tidy up the living room and kitchen. By the afternoon, Chris and I decided to drive out for coffee, just the two of us. It was nice to escape the house for a bit and be alone with him to reset. In the car, he asked me if I was comfortable, if I was having a good time, and I admitted that I was still a little wary around his dad. Chris sighed. He's like that sometimes. Don't worry too much about it. He likes you, I can tell. It's just, he has his own ways of expressing things. I nodded and let it go. Maybe it was just in my head. Or maybe I was unused to being in such a tight-knit environment, where everyone's presence and reactions seemed more intense. The third day of my stay, the day that would define the rest of my trip and cast a long shadow over the coming month, started out chilly but bright. Chris had to go to Academy for a few hours, and I was supposed to meet my friend Nicole in town for lunch. Initially, I thought Chris and I might ride together. After all, we were leaving at roughly the same time. Then he offered a different, we should both take our own cars, so I wouldn't risk being late to meet Nicole if anything came up at his Academy session. I didn't argue. It made sense, though a small part of me wondered if he just wanted some space. But no, that was silly. He'd always been thoughtful, rarely letting me bend my schedule around his. So I said okay and went to get ready. Chris's dad was out in the driveway when we emerged. He was checking the oil in his own car, which Chris would be driving that day. It was an older model sedan, the paint job a bit worn but still in good condition. The father didn't say much to me, just nodded in greeting. Chris and I exchanged a glance. He seemed a little uneasy, but I couldn't place why. Maybe they'd had words that morning about me staying as long as I was. Or maybe the father just wasn't a morning person. We pulled out of the driveway, Chris in front, me following behind in my own car. I remember checking my phone for directions, even though I planned to just follow him until he turned off for the Academy. The plan was that once we hit the main road, we'd split up, and I'd continue on to meet Nicole. I felt good about the day, excited to see an old friend I rarely got to meet in person. We were all set to drive out of the neighborhood, which had these little winding streets that fed into a larger road. We approached the intersection near the entrance of the subdivision. Chris's brake lights flickered as he inched forward. Then he seemed to hesitate. The street was moderately busy, but from my vantage point, I thought he had enough space to move. In my mind, he was about to pull out completely, so I relaxed my own brakes, preparing to follow. But then he stopped short. I caught the movement of another car crossing the intersection in front of him, but somehow my timing was off. My foot went for the brake a second too late. My front bumper collided with his dad's car, that sickening crunch of metal on metal. It wasn't a huge crash, but it was enough to jolt me in my seat and send a wave of panic rushing through my body. My heart pounded. My mind raced. I threw the car into park and scrambled out to see if Chris was okay, to examine the damage. Chris also got out, eyes wide, immediately checking me over. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice trembling with shock. "No, I'm fine. Are you okay?" He nodded. Physically, we seemed okay. The impact wasn't high speed, but the front of my car was definitely damaged. Metal bent inward, the hood jammed up a bit, the paint scraped off. His dad's car, though it had less damage, still had a noticeable dent and scratches on the rear. In that moment, my heart sank. I knew how particular his father was about his belongings, especially the car he'd had for years. I knew that I was the one at fault. I could have sworn Chris was about to go, but I should have double-checked before rolling forward. All these thoughts rushed through my head, colliding with the panic and the guilt that were battling for dominance in my chest. I apologized profusely over and over. I recall babbling something like, "I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." Chris tried to calm me, placing a hand on my shoulder, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he was shaken. Also, beneath his attempt at composure, there was a flicker of something like dismay or frustration. Or maybe it was fear of what his dad would say. A couple of neighbors peeked out from their windows, and one even stepped outside to ask if we were okay. We assured them we were. My phone was still in my car, but I remember Chris's phone buzzing in his pocket. Maybe his mom was texting, or maybe it was just a notification from one of his group chats. Everything felt surreal in those few minutes. Time slowed as I surveyed the damage, apologized again, and tried to figure out what to do next. I offered my insurance right away, of course. It was clearly my fault. "It's fine, we'll handle it," Chris kept saying. "It's okay, don't worry about it," he repeated, though I could see a slight tension around his jaw. I insisted on paying for anything out of pocket if they didn't want to go through insurance, whatever they preferred. Chris said we'd figure it out later, that we should just drive back to the house and let his dad. The mention of going back to the house made me feel nauseous with worry. Facing Chris's dad so soon after I crashed into his car was the last thing I want, but there was no alternative. As we drove back, me trailing behind Chris once again, I kept replaying that split second in my mind. Why hadn't I checked more carefully? Why had I assumed he was pulling out? The guilt gnawed at me. I knew no amount of apologizing could undo the damage. Sure, in the grand scheme of things, it was just a fender bender, but it also felt like so much more, like a sign that I was clumsy, irresponsible, or that I didn't belong in the well-ordered life of his family. When we got back, Chris's mom and sister were in the living room. I walked in, my face pale and my hands shaking. I started apologizing immediately, tears threatening to spill from my eyes. I couldn't read their expressions fully. Concern, definite, but also a bit of confusion. Chris was still trembling with leftover adrenaline. What happened? His mom asked gently, coming over to place a hand on my arm. I hit Chris's car. Or, well, your husband's car. The sedan. My voice wavered as I spoke. Are you two okay? She asked, eyes wide. We both assured her that physically we were fine, no injuries, just a small collision. She looked relieved at that, but then exhaled as though preparing herself for the fallout with her husband. She knew how he was with his possessions, especially that car. Chris's sister tried to calm me down, echoing their mom's sentiment. It's really okay. Accidents happen. Nobody's hurt, and that's what matters. It's just a car. Chris, though, was unusually quiet. I watched him pace a little, running a hand through his hair. If your dad still has a problem with me, he could address me directly. I stared at him, my stomach twisting, waiting for some sign that this was going to be okay. But he just looked up and said, Dad wants to know what happened. Then, in front of me and the rest of the family, he asked, how mad is Dad? That question hung in the air. I felt my eyes start to sting with tears, though I tried to keep them at bay. How mad was Dad? The way he asked it confirmed my worst fear, that he expected his dad to be furious and that maybe I was in for a real confrontation. I lowered my gaze, feeling that wave of guilt swell all over again. His mom and sister insisted it was fine. They repeated the same line. It's just a car. But I could sense that wasn't entirely true when it came to his dad. Maybe he wouldn't scream or shout, but I anticipated a quiet, palpable disappointment. And something about that might be even worse. Chris's academy plans for that day were obviously postponed. My lunch with Nicole was out the window. I decided not to leave the house at all. I couldn't imagine enjoying a meal with a friend while this situation loomed back at the house. Instead, I stuck by Chris, who hovered around the living room, occasionally going to the garage to inspect the damage with his mother or make a phone call to a local mechanic. My anxiety skyrocketed with each passing minute. By the late afternoon, his dad finally arrived home. I considered hiding upstairs or in the kitchen, but I decided it would be worse to appear cowardly. So I stayed in the living room. When he entered, he set his keys on the table, glanced at me, and then looked at Chris. There was no immediate out. He just asked, "You two all right?" We nodded. He gave a curt nod back, then told Chris to show him the car. I hung back, heart thudding against my ribs, feeling like a child waiting for the principal's verdict. In those moments, the house felt oppressive. Even though it was quite large with wide windows and natural light, my anxiety colored everything with a sense of dread. Chris's mom eventually sat near me on the couch, trying to reassure me. "It'll be okay," she said softly, noticing how I picked at the edge of the throw pillow. "It's just a car. He's probably just concerned that you or Chris might have been hurt." "That's it." I nodded but remained silent, my mind going a mile a minute. A few minutes later, Chris reappeared, his expression guarded. He told me that his dad wasn't so much angry about the car itself, but I could tell something was off. I tried apologizing again, offering my insurance details. I even said, "I'll pay for anything. I promise. Whatever needs to be done." But the father declined, in a quiet, measured tone, saying, "It's fine. We'll handle it." That was it, but the tension was still there. After that, Chris barely spoke to me for the rest of the day. We sat in the living room, me on one couch, him on the other, scrolling our phones or half-watching TV. His silence cut me more deeply than any scolding from his father would have. I felt like I'd let him down and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. Then, at one point that evening, I went upstairs to get a sweater from the guest room because I felt cold. When I came back down, Chris and his mom were whispering in the kitchen. The moment I stepped into the doorway, they stopped talking. There was a flash of guilt on her face and a flicker of tension on Chris's. My stomach sank. They had clearly been discussing me or the accident, or maybe how to manage his dad's feelings. I just stammered, "Oh, sorry," and retreated back into the living room, feeling like an intruder in their home. Soon after, Chris joined me again, but the atmosphere never recovered. I felt completely on edge, half ashamed, half angry at myself for causing the situation, and half confused by the way his family was handled. Logically, I knew accidents happen, but the emotional undercurrent was impossible to ignore. The next day, I decided it was best if I left. The original plan had been to stay another night, but the vibe in the house was too thick with awkwardness. Chris walked me out to my car, which was still slightly banged up but drivable. He gave me a subdued hug, apologized for everything, said it would all blow over. Then, as I climbed into the driver's seat, he admitted something that I wish he'd told me sooner. My dad's not that mad about the car. He's more upset that you stayed longer than we initially discussed. I blinked, genuinely confused. What do you mean? I thought he was fine with the plan. I've been here 4 nights, like you and I arranged. He sighed, looking frustrated. He had it in his head that you'd only stay 2 nights. I guess Mom and I never clarified that. He didn't say anything to me until this morning. I stared at it. Chris, I wish you'd told me. I had no idea he expected me to leave earlier. I would have left if I'd known. I know, he murmured, looking pained. I should have told you. I just didn't realize how he felt until it was too late. I nodded slowly, wondering if that explained his father's tight-lipped attitude and the whispering behind my back. All that silent disapproval, swirling around in ways I couldn't even parse. Part of me wanted to rail against how unfair it felt. How was I supposed to know if they never communicated it to me? But another part of me felt drained and just wanted to go home. The drive back was lonely, despite the usual bustle of the highways. I replayed every conversation from the night before, every glance or whispered exchange. I kept beating myself up. Why couldn't I do anything right in that house? Was I an idiot for not noticing the father's tension earlier? Should I have left the second or third day? All these thoughts tugged at me, making the 3-hour drive feel much longer. Over the next couple of weeks, Chris and I didn't talk about the accident or his dad. We called and texted regularly, but the subject was conspicuously absent. I'd ask how the car repair process was going, and he'd just say it was fine, that his dad decided to get it fixed at some local shop and that I shouldn't worry about it. I'd ask if I owed anything, and he'd dodge the question, telling me I should save my money. I felt uneasy about that. I wanted to pay my share, especially since the fault was obviously mine. But he shut down those offers. I assumed maybe the tension had lessened over time, that maybe his dad shrugged it off. After all, nobody had pressed me for insurance information. But something lingered in my gut, a feeling that not everything was as resolved as Chris wanted me to believe. Maybe it was just the memory of that whispered conversation between Chris and his mom, or how Chris had asked, "How mad is Dad?" right in front of me. I tried to push it aside, focusing on daily life, on work, on the new year that was supposed to be full of promise. Then, a month after the accident, during one of our phone calls, Chris brought it up. I was sitting on my couch at home, crocheting a blanket for my niece, with the phone balanced against my ear. We were chatting about trivial things when he said, "Hey, there's something I wanted to talk to you about." I immediately felt my stomach tighten. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "So, remember the day of the accident?" he began. "When Dad asked about your insurance and you answered him?" My mind raced back to that uncomfortable scene in his living room. I recalled his dad saying something along the lines of, "What did your mom say about insurance?" And I gave some short response like, "She said it's fine, and that I'll pay for everything myself." "Yeah, I remember." He paused before continuing. "Well, you sounded like you didn't care. At least that's what Dad said. He thought your tone was off, like you weren't taking it seriously." I gripped the yarn in my lap, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I was terrified. I was practically shaking. "What tone is he talking about?" Chris cleared his throat. "He said you came off dismissive, like you didn't care about the damage or what it might cost. He felt like you were just giving a short answer without much emotion, like it was an inconvenience." I stared at the wall in disbelief. How was I supposed to sound? I was horrified. I apologized. I offered to pay. I felt so guilty I could barely talk. Was I supposed to be jumping up and down, being all upbeat about it? Chris hesitated. "Mom said the same thing, that you sounded kind of stiff. She told Dad maybe you were nervous, but I guess Dad still mentions it sometimes." That stung even more, because his mom had been the one comforting me the entire time, telling me not to worry. "So your mom told him that too? Or she agreed with him?" I asked, my voice tight. "Something like that," Chris muttered. "She said you were obviously scared, but Dad's point is that your tone could have been more—" He trailed off, and I could almost hear him wincing over the phone. "I don't know, like you were more upbeat or regretful or something." I didn't know whether to laugh in frustration or break down in tears. I tried apologizing over and over. I offered to do anything. I was shaking, Chris. What else was I supposed to do? Perform some big act? Smile and wave? No, he said quickly. "I just think you and my dad have different ways of communicating. He might have expected something else." I closed my eyes, taking a steadying breath. "Why are you telling me this now?" A month later, he sighed, his breath crackling in the receiver. "I don't know. It came up again recently. He asked me if you were still planning on paying or if you've forgotten. And I explained we're willing to pay anything needed, but he said she didn't sound too bothered about it at the time, so I wanted to let you know. I didn't mean to upset you. I felt a surge of hurt. Well, you did. And now it feels like he and your mom were both judging me behind my back for how I responded in a moment of extreme stress. And you're only telling me about it now? I'm sorry, Chris said soft. I just didn't want to bring it up earlier and make you feel worse. Too late for that, I thought. My eyes stung, remembering how humiliating it had been to cause the accident in the first place, how my heart was in my throat every time I saw his father's face after. Look, I don't know how to fix this, I said, my voice breaking. I did everything I could to show how sorry I was, and if he wants me to pay, I will. I told you that from the start. I know, Chris. I told him that too. We fell into an uneasy silence. I started to wonder if this was about more than just the car. Maybe it was about me staying longer than expected, or about me not being the kind of person they envisioned for their son. Maybe they expected a future daughter-in-law to be more effusive or more attuned to their family's style of communication. Here I was, stumbling around, feeling more and more alien each time. I found myself blurting out, I feel really uncomfortable. I feel judged. And now I don't know if I even want to stay at your place anymore in the future. Chris paused before responding. Don't say that. It'll blow over, I promise. Dad's just set in his ways. He says these things and then he forgets about them. Mom's probably just trying to help interpret, you know? I let out a shaky breath. But that night, she whispered with you behind my back, then acted like everything was fine to my face. That's not fair. I know you guys have a close family dynamic, and you're used to handling things your own way, but it made me feel singled out. Like I was the butt of some inside discussion. It wasn't about that, Chris insisted. We were just talking about how best to bring up the insurance with you. Because Dad hates confrontation. Mom wanted me to handle it. That's all. But the bitter feeling remained. I thought of the times I'd spent in that house, the dinners, the jokes, the sense that I was finally part of something bigger. And now, it was all overshadowed by an accident and a misunderstanding about my tone. I knew I was sensitive, but this felt like too much. I couldn't help letting my frustrations spill out. I wish you hadn't told me, I said at last, my voice rising slightly. It was a month ago. You could have told me sooner, or let it go. But now you've basically reopened this wound, and I feel humiliated all over again. Chris tried to backtrack, saying he was just trying to be honest, that he didn't want secrets between us. But my mind was already swirling. Let's just give me some space, I mumbled, and then hung up, my hands shaking from the burst of anger and shame coursing through. The weeks that followed were a haze of second-guessing. Whenever Chris called or texted, part of me worried he'd bring up his dad again. Sometimes we tiptoed around the subject. Other times, I grilled him, asking if his dad or mom had made more comments about me. He usually said no, but I had trouble trusting that I was getting the whole story. I felt like an outsider, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit into the beautiful picture of his close-knit family. We'd only been dating 9 months, and long distance for 6 of those. It wasn't like we were engaged, but we were serious enough to talk about a future. If I was going to be a part of Chris's life long-term, that meant being part of his family dynamic too. The question was, did I even want that? Could I handle feeling judged every time I slipped up or said something they didn't like? Was I too sensitive, or were they being unreasonably harsh? My own mother thought the whole thing was silly. They should just take the insurance if they're so worried, she said pragmatically when I told her, or let you pay out of pocket. And what's this about your tone? It sounds like they're making a big deal out of nothing. I knew she was right in some ways, but I also recognized I was dealing with Chris's father's personality, with Chris's own sense of filial duty. He'd grown up in that household. He knew the unspoken rules, how to handle the old-school approach. I was an outsider, and maybe I'd never fully catch on. One evening, I called Nicole, my friend I'd never gotten to see that day because of the accident, to vent about everything. That's insane, she said. If you were apologetic, why would they judge how you sounded? I chewed my lip, pacing around my living. They think I should have sounded more upbeat, apparently, which makes zero sense to me. I was upset. I felt horrible. Nicole snorted. Some people want tears and big gestures. Maybe they think your apology was too mechanical. I shrugged, though she couldn't see me. All I can do now is explain how I felt, but I also worry if that'll make it worse. Chris says to let it blow over. Yeah, she said carefully. But is that how you want to live? Tiptoeing around his dad's moods? I didn't have a good answer to that. My relationship with Chris was worth a lot to me, but this ordeal was the most friction I'd felt with his family. It made me realize that being with someone often means navigating their entire network of relationships, especially if they're close-knit. And maybe I was used to a different style, where issues are hashed out more direct. The whispering, the behind-the-scenes complaining about my tone, it all felt so foreign and uncomfortable. Over the next few days, I drafted messages to Chris that I never sent. Messages telling him exactly how betrayed I felt that his mom, who had reassured me so kindly, could later criticize the way I spoke. Messages telling him I wanted to pay for the car damages, itemized so I could put the entire thing behind me. Messages telling him I wasn't sure if I could handle his family dynamic long-term, but each time I stopped myself, worried I'd hurt him or drive a wedge between us. Eventually, we did have a real conversation about it, late one night on a video call. He was in his bedroom, and I could see the faint outline of his dresser and a poster on the wall behind him. I was sitting at my desk, eyes tired from a long day of work. The screen lit up his features, and I could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Look," he said, "I'm sorry about how this all went down. I should have told you my dad's real feelings from the start. The day you left, when I said he was upset about you staying longer, he was. But I tried to smooth it over. I didn't want you to feel worse. I guess in the process, I ended up hurting." I let out a long breath. "I just don't understand why he didn't tell me himself, or why you guys had to whisper about it." Chris rubbed the back of his neck. "It's how we handle stuff. Mom usually tries to mediate so Dad won't say something he regrets. They meant well, I promise." I nodded slowly, though the hurt still lingered. "Fine. So what do I do now? We have this big elephant in the room. I don't want your dad thinking I'm not paying or that I don't care. I also don't want to be scolded for my tone if I show how upset I am." He looked away, exhaling. "I talked to Dad, and he said the shop bill wasn't too bad. He's not pressing us for it. I told him you'd pitch in, and he said it was no big deal." "No big deal?" "He literally told you a month later that I seemed like I didn't care." "He's a complicated guy," Chris said, a weary smile ghosting his lips. "He'll get over it, trust me. And he's not out to get you. I think part of it is that he's old school and wanted a more formal apology, like something over the phone the next day. I don't know. He has these expectations sometimes." I crossed my arms. "I left that morning without seeing him, remember? He was at work." "I know," Chris replied. "Look, if you want, I can arrange a call with him. Or you can just write him a note or something, explaining how you felt. It might help clear the air." I bristled at the suggestion. The idea of me, at 22, writing a formal apology note like some sort of child to a father figure felt humiliating. But at the same time, if it could help, well, maybe I should swallow my pride. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. Time passed, and I kept wrestling with those emotions. The tension wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about feeling unwelcome, misunderstood, about realizing that Chris's parents might have a different yardstick for measuring respect or sincerity, about wondering if my more reserved personality would always clash with their expectations, about suspecting that behind every closed door in that house there might be whispers about me, about how I behave, how I speak, how I don't quite fit in. When I voiced those concerns to Chris, he insisted I was overthinking it, that I was part of the family in their eyes. But sometimes words don't match reality. I recalled how quickly they accepted me before the accident, how they'd always insisted I stay for meals, how they included me in holiday plans. Now, the entire atmosphere felt tainted, as if a single event had triggered a re-evaluation of who I was, or maybe they'd always had reservations, and the accident just brought them to the surface. I found myself double-checking my own behavior, replaying every conversation in my head, questioning whether I truly was being too sensitive. Some nights, it kept me awake, picturing that dreaded moment of collision, the helplessness I felt, the flash of panic on Chris's face as he realized what happened, then the hush when we got back to the house, the mother's reassuring words that now rang hollow, the father's quiet disapproval, the sister's look of pity, and a month later, the renewed sense of shame when Chris told me they'd discussed my tone. Even though part of me wanted to bury the whole incident, I also knew that ignoring it could create deeper cracks in my relationship with Chris. So, after a lot of soul-searching, I decided to call his mom directly. Chris gave me her number, and I asked him not to warn her in advance so we could have a genuine conversation. It was a nerve-wracking decision, but I wanted to clear the air. When she picked up, I introduced myself, trying to sound calm. "I just wanted to talk to you about the accident," I began, feeling my pulse race. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and Chris told me there was some concern about how I sounded that day. I wanted to let you know that I was actually extremely upset, and if it came across otherwise, I'm really sorry." She paused for a moment, long enough to make me worry that this was a huge mistake. Then she spoke in a surprisingly gentle tone. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't have to apologize. I know you were upset. I could see it in your eyes. It's just that your father well, Chris's father, my husband, sometimes expects people to, I don't know, express things more dramatically, I guess. He grew up in a family where apologies were very demonstrative." I breathed out slowly. "I see. I didn't realize. It's just not how I communicate. I felt so awful that day, I was trying to hold it together. I'm not the type to break down crying in front of everyone. I understand, she said. I really do. I told him that. He just kept insisting you should have sounded more remorseful, but honestly, it's behind us. I don't want you to think we're still stewing on. A wave of relief washed over. Thank you, I said soft. I just wanted to make sure there were no hard feelings. And I hope you understand I'm totally willing to pay for the damage. She assured me it was all taken care of, that Chris's father had found a reasonable mechanic, and that we shouldn't worry. He's just a bit set in his ways, dear, but he'll move on. Give him a little time. Next time you come, things will be fine. I thanked her, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. Though she was kind, the conversation still confirmed that they'd definitely been scrutinizing my every reaction. But at least now it was out in the open. At least I had some closure, even if it meant acknowledging that her husband wanted a type of emotional display that wasn't natural. After that call, Chris told me his dad appreciated the gesture. I never spoke to his dad directly about it, but apparently Chris's mom passed along the message that I'd reached out. So, in a sense, that was that. And yet, something inside me remained unsettled. I wondered if I was truly in the clear now, or if there'd always be some part of me that didn't quite meet their expectations. I thought about how small misunderstandings can spiral when there's a culture clash or a difference in family style. Maybe that was part of this. The old-school father with strong opinions about how a proper apology should sound, versus me, a woman in my early 20s who'd grown up in a more independent environment, taught not to display all my emotions in front of others. Am I being too sensitive, as Chris sometimes gently suggests? Or do I have a right to feel upset that I was judged for not performing sorrow in the way they wanted? These questions linger, even as life moves forward. The tension is still there in my mind, though it's not as raw as before. In the end, I told Chris that if something like this ever happens again, if his father or mother has complaints or concerns about my behavior, my tone, or my presence, I want them to bring it up openly rather than weeks or months later. We need open communication, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment. Because the alternative, navigating whispers and half-revealed resentments, breeds more discomfort and misunderstanding. Chris agreed, promising to be more forthright. Will that promise hold up under the weight of his father's opinions? I can't say for sure. I do know that I love Chris enough to try. And I know that sometimes people who have strong bonds, like his close-knit family, also have strong opinions and expectations. As for me, I'm learning to stand my ground, to speak up for myself, to set boundaries where needed. It's a balancing act, wanting his family's acceptance without sacrificing my own integrity. I still think back to that bright, cold morning when I followed Chris out of the driveway and replay the moment my car tapped his father's bumper. That single second changed so many things. My perception of his father, their perception of me, the entire atmosphere of that New Year's visit. Maybe in time, it'll fade to a footnote in the broader story of Chris. Maybe it'll become a funny anecdote about how I tapped his dad's car and freaked out for weeks, only to find out everything was fine. Or maybe it's the first real test of navigating the complexities of a family that might never fully make sense to me. For now, I'm choosing to move forward, albeit cautiously, with the knowledge that even minor accidents can have major ripples in a relationship. The next time I'm invited to Chris's parents' home, I'll go with a mixture of hope and a bit of lingering anxiety. And if his father ever wants to talk about my tone again, I'll do my best to explain how I feel without letting shame silence me. Accidents happen, they are part of life. What's harder is dealing with people's reactions, the whispered conversations, the quiet judgments, the words that surface a month later to reopen wounds you thought were healing. But maybe those moments of discomfort and confrontation teach us the lessons we most need to learn about each other, about boundaries, communication styles, and the ways we show remorse and acceptance. Whether or not it makes our bond stronger remains to be seen. For now, I just keep reminding myself that I'm doing the best I can, that I offered every apology I could, and that ultimately, a family's love, or acceptance, should go beyond a single mishap, no matter how it's handled in the moment. And though the sting of their whispers still clings to my memory, I'm hopeful that with honesty and time, we'll find a way to bridge the gap. After all, if Chris and I continue to build a life together, we'll need more than a grudging tolerance of each other's differences. We'll need mutual understanding, respect, and the willingness to speak openly, even when it hurts. That, more than any forced apology or forced cheerfulness, is the only real path